No, wow. Wonderful. All I have. So I'm Pete Nelson, and I do teach mathematics at North Country Community College. I've been an amateur historian here in the park for a while. There are a lot of amateur historians in the park, let's be honest about that. I'm in the middle of, well, I'm in the beginning of writing a book that's been languishing because I've been too busy teaching math and doing other stuff. But I decided about a year ago to change that and get serious about history. Because amateur history is really important. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it seriously. At least I think so. So I'm in graduate school in a history program for SUNY Portland. And I intend to do that for the rest of my life. So I love math and I'll always teach it at least a little bit. But I have fallen in love with history. And actually, this place is one of the reasons that I did fall in love with history in the first place. I should warn you right away. I have severe hearing loss for a bunch of reasons I won't bore you with. And this weekend I was in the wilderness. My wife and I have a little in-holding in the middle of the high peaks. Most people don't even know it's there. And sure enough, the little case that holds my hearing aids, the latch wasn't fully latched and I lost one. So I have one hearing aid. My good ear doesn't have a hearing aid right now. So I love being interrupted, questions, challenges, anything, but you might have to speak pretty clearly and I apologize for that. So let me ask a question of all of you in this packed room. How many of you know something about Eagle Nest already? Nobody. It's gonna be fun. Okay. So Eagle Nest is a place on Eagle Lake, which is one of the chain of lakes that include Blue Mountain Lake, is the primary lake, Blue Mountain Lake, and then Eagle Lake and Nuwana Lake. And the story behind it is mysterious and interesting. So let's get to it. I'll get it. Hello.
Is it on?
Who put the battery in?
It was working like 10
At
minutes.
least, oh yeah, there we go. There we go. Good start, right? So, first of all, although, and I'll sort of jump to a piece of a conclusion. Definitive is not going to happen. Too complicated a story, and history itself is too complicated in the park. We'll get close, at least I think so. So this involves a great deal of research, which is what I love to do. So these are three historians who are working today. They are experts, all three of them, on the history of blacks in the Adirondack, particularly free blacks, and the history of the Underground Railroad. I am not an expert on those things. I know some things, and I know certainly pieces of it well because of the study I've done. But each of those is extremely important in developing the information I have to talk about. Then there are three historians or writers from the past. They will figure prominently, especially Harold Hochschild, who was the owner and resident of Eagle Nest for many, many years. He's the founder of the Adirondack Museum. He headed the temporary study commission that led to the development of the APA. I research various places, I won't bore you with that, and then I always have to pay an honor to two people that you probably don't know, but they live on the shore of Blue Mountain Lake, and they're the reason that I'm in the Adirondacks. So I always thank Paul and Virginia Maloney. Here's what we'll do. I'll talk about the mystery, the claim that it was an Underground Railroad stop, the case for it, the case against it, and then my shot at how close we get to deciding what the truth is. As for the mystery, let's start with this. At Eagle Nest now is a place called Blue Mountain Center. So Harold Hochschild was a billionaire. He made his fortune in mining. Eagle Nest was his retreat. And although it's not an ostentatious great camp, pretty big facility. And he made arrangements with his son, Adam Hochschild, who's a well-known writer and author, to turn this into a writing center. And since then it's expanded. So writers, artists, musicians, it's still primarily a writing center, a place that people can go to work on their craft. I would like to share with you some writing that was composed on the shores of Eagle Lake at Eagle Nest. But bear with me for a moment while I read a little prose to you. It was a bleak December 25 years ago. Along the piers of each of the great rivers which environ Manhattan Island, the icy waves dashed and raged noisily, for both wind and tide were high. And upon one of these piers stood a watchman, who for wonder was wide awake. He was wrapped in his large coat, and as he leaned against the lamppost on the pier, its faint and flickering light revealed a full, florid, and honest countenance, one which seemed to have been touched by the finger of true humanity. He seemed to be rather past middle age, but stout, well-built, and hardy. At times he would look out upon the dark and angry waters, but no one seemed to be abroad, and an occasional yawn told that his was sleepy work. The assaults of the storm departed, and with an exclamation of surprise, he looked up the pier at something very strange, which seemed to be reeling down toward him. It seemed to walk like a human being, but if it was dressed strangely for a winter night, for it was robed in white. "Yea, I don't believe in ghosts," said the watchman, as a shudder passed over his huge frame. "If I did, I'd say, 'Here's one by hokey.'" The figure came nearer. Yeah, you're getting the idea, right? It's good prose, just hold on. There's a story behind this. The figure came nearer still, and the watchman saw the pale face of a woman, young, very beautiful, with great wild black eyes and hair streaming in tangled tresses from her uncovered head down upon white shoulders that had not even a shawl to shield them from the merciless storm. "Where are you going?" he cried as he left the lamppost and with a single step stood in front of her. "To death! Hinder me not," she said in a tone so low, so deep that it thrilled away down into the old watchman's strong heart, like the toll of a funeral bell. And she raised a white round arm, and with a hand which sparkled with jeweled rings in that dim lamplight, she motioned for him to stand aside. "Lady, you are too young to die, and much too beautiful and delicate to be out in this terrible storm with only your thin nightdress on. You have been in some dream, or else some great wrong has been done." "Yes, a great wrong, but oh, it was not a dream, it was not a dream. My father called me a terrible name and bade me go forth and hide my shame from him and all the world. In death only can it be hidden. Let me go, let me go. The spirit of the dark waters is calling, let me go." The author's, well, first of all, the name of this is Elfrida, the Red Rover's Daughter. It was published by Beadle and Company in 1862, which might explain a little bit of why this flowery purple prose is assaulting you from women. It was written by a gentleman named Colonel Edward Zane Carroll Judson. Know that name? Well, let me give you some of the other names he went by as he did various things in life. Edward Minturn, Ethelbert the Wanderer, whoopsie. Reckless Ralph, Sherwood Stanley, Julia Edwards, Charlie Cluline, or the one that he was most famously known by, Ned Buttline. That ring a bell. So Ned Buttline was quite the character. Let me tell you about Ned Buttline a little bit. He was the preeminent dime novelist in America, really beginning of the trash novel. He was the apex of the trash novel in America. He led the Astor Place riot. He dueled with and shot people. He was hung and then shot and then saved at the last minute when he was in prison for the Astor Place riots. He started, or was one of the people who started the Know Nothing movement, which was very xenophobic. He was the discoverer of Buffalo Bill. He found Bill Cody sitting by the side of the street at something, and then he created this whole persona. He gave himself that persona. Buffalo Bill Cody's in the center. Ned Buttline is to the left. Was he a great Western explorer and cowboy type? No, but he made himself look the part. He was married 6 times. This is not made up now. He's married 6 times, and at one point, he's married to 2 women at the same time. 2 different homes, 2 different locales. He is quite the guy. Some people, including one of his biographers, thought he was just an amazing American. Another guy, this is awesome. So Betsy Colwell, who was the editor of Adirondack Life, wrote an article in 1991 about Ned Buntline, and she found this wonderful description written by a contemporary, a writer who didn't think too highly of him, who referred to Ned Buntline as, and I quote, a black-hearted toad, a rank coward, an assassin, a seducer, and a murderer, with a face like a bladder of lard, almost goggle-eyed, and red-headed. So the book, this is the best title for the book I think I ever wrote. The book, this was written by Thomas C. Patterson, and the book he wrote was called From Private Life, Public Career, and Real Character of That Odious Rascal Ned Buntline, as developed by his conduct to his past wife, present wife, and his various paramours, completely lifting up the veil and unmasking to a horror-stricken community his debaucheries, adulteries, revelries, cruelties, threats, and murders. Ned Buntline. If you read more about him, you'll find that none of that's integration. What does this have to do with? Well, the mystery is this. Ned Buntline was the first resident of Eagle Nest. But when he became, and this is a contemporary photo in 1860 or 61. But when he became a resident of Eagle Nest, it was already like that, in the middle of nowhere. Why? That's a question we will explore. So here's the claim. The claim goes back a long way, where the pieces that make this claim plausible go back a long way. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, although I certainly could, but the idea that was promulgated by a lot of writers, especially in the 19th century, is Native Americans didn't live, Indians just don't live. All false. They certainly did. In Ticonderoga, where I teach mathematics, the North Country Community College campus building, to the right, this is true, you can actually see a little bit of depressed ground winding up the hill. It's obviously different than the rest of the ground around it, even though it's just lawn. And the reason is it's been compressed by 10,000 years of traffic between Lake George and Lake Champlain. Great trail between the 2 waters. A long, long history. Permanent settlement throughout the heart of the Adirondacks, not just in the Champlain Valley or the periphery. Native Americans have been here for a long time. When Euro-American explorers started coming into the region, it was Mohawk and Abenaki's guides who took them lots of places, and lots of those places were in the heart of the Adirondacks, including one I'm about to talk about. There were long-standing paths and trails for commerce, for hunting, for moving to settlements, for a variety of purposes. And the more archaeology that's done, the more we understand about these paths. Many of the roads that you know in the park, including Route 9, Route 30, follow old Native American paths. Here's one that's been understood for a while, although all the details aren't fully understood. But there were paths that went to the St. Lawrence, went to Canadian territory, and they started pretty near where we are, in the Glens Falls area, where there were trails long established, trails, even roads you might say from the Mohawk Valley, wound through the heart of the park, usually following, or mostly I should say, following water routes, which made travel much easier, especially in winter, through the Tupper Lake area and then up and to the St. Lawrence. Let's zoom in on a piece of that. This is a contemporary map of the Blue Mountain Lake area. So now we're in the central Adirondacks in Hamilton County with the existing roads. We know for sure that a couple of Native American paths went this way. So first, up the Hudson River to its confluence with the Cedar River. Then from there, the Cedar River into an area of wetlands and streams, some of which are altered by damming, but the route is still mostly there. So from here, there were two routes that Native Americans applied for centuries. One went along those streams and wetlands by Rock Lake, Lake Durant, which didn't exist until the 20th century when it got dammed, near the shore of Blue Mountain Lake, at which point a short ferry took you to that lake. And I'm sure some of you in the room know that if you're at Blue Mountain Lake, you can go all the way to Canada. Blue Mountain Lake goes all the way down, Racket Lake, Fork Lake, Racket River, Long Lake, up we go, up Gotcha, and so on, and the Racket itself. This is exactly the route that Native American guides took Ebenezer Emmons on in 1836. Ebenezer Emmons was a geologist. I'm sure some of you recognize that name, but he was the first geologist to do a significant study of the interior of the park. A second route followed the Cedar River further. So the Cedar River winds around. This area is known as Sprague Clearing to this day. I couldn't find out much about Sprague except to know that whoever he was, he settled there early in the 19th century. So the Cedar River route went to about that, and then there was a path. The path went all the way to Eagle Lake, which is the upper left-hand corner. That path has been there for centuries. If you walk the North Hill Placid Trail, some of it's on that path to this day. So here's a map that was made in 1860 of the same region. And just to show that this was a known quantity at the time, if I zoom in on this, there's Eagle Lake, and there's the path. It's described in this 1860 map as a road, which I'll get into a little bit later. And you can actually see, it's a little hard to see, but up there, it's got a little square indicating a settlement. It says Dead Butt Line. So 1860, Dead Butt Line is there. Come back to that. So the plan was that because there was a well-established Native American route and paths all the way to Eagle Lake and then beyond to Canada, that might have been, and some people think was, a route that the Underground Railroad system used. What's that system? Well, this is not a very good slide on the map at the Underground Railroad Museum, North Star Underground Railroad Museum in Keysville. And I highlighted in blue to make it easier for you to see. Those are all known routes. So through the Mohawk Valley and then north, near Watertown to Canada. Most traffic, the Underground Railroad was through the Champlain Valley. All this well documented. There were crossing points in the Montreal area, but there was a lot of activity closer to Ogdensburg. So you can see that lots of routes go there. The argument is, those are circuitous. They're obviously avoiding the interior of the park because it's tough going. But if you wanted a more direct route where you were unlikely to be seen by anybody, what about going that way on this ancient Native American path? So people have talked about this for years, right? For decades, long before I had any interest or knowledge. Maybe there was an Underground Railroad route this direction. So in order to have any sense of whether that is possible, we have to look at a fairly complicated timeline. So a couple slides will make you want to leave, but I'm not going to go through all the slides, every line in it, but highlights things. So I'll come back to this guy, but a gentleman named Gerrit Smith in 1836 inherits Township 34, which is the Cotton Crossfield Township that holds Eagle Nest from his father, Peter Smith. Peter Smith is one of the richest people in the world. At the time, he's either the richest or second richest man in the United States. He's a partner of John Jacob Astor, and he's made a fortune in the fur trade. So he owns hundreds of thousands of acres in the North Country, and his son Gerrit inherits that. And he, in his life, was one of the wealthiest people in the United States. So Township 34 is just one of 400,000 or 500,000 acres of land that Gerrit Smith inherits from his father. Somewhere around 1840, organized Underground Railroad activities began in the Adirondack region, following the routes that you saw previously on the map, and most of it through the Champlain Valley. In 1856, Ned Buttline occupies the Eagle Nest clearing, and we'll come back to that. But that's when he arrives. And there's already clearing there. So what happened between roughly 1840 and 1856? That's what we want to know. So, a larger context, how many people know about Gerrit Smith? A couple hands go up. This could be an entire evening just talking about Gerrit Smith. Gerrit Smith was an ardent abolitionist, and he had the power and means to do something about it. So, he wanted free blacks to be able to help determine their own destiny, to find a place and a context in which they could feel a sense of safety and have some political power. Standing in the way of that, besides ardent racism and the violence of slavery, was the law in New York. Although it was a free state, a law had been passed, I think in 1825, I forget. But it required Black men to have $250 in property if they wanted to be able to vote. There was obviously no such requirement for white men. And this is before suburbs, so there was no voting for women. But they had to have that kind of proved property worth, income worth, in order to be able to vote. So Gerrit Smith said, well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take 120,000 acres all over the North Country, most of it in the Adirondacks, much of it in the Lake Placid, North Elba area, and I'm going to give it away, 40 acres at a time. And those 40 acres will be offered to free blacks. Now, the 40 acres in and of themselves, unimproved, aren't worth $250. But if they're improved by farming, building a couple structures, now we're in business. So that's what he did. For a while, it was heavily promoted by people at the forefront of the abolitionist movement. And it had a profound effect on history over time. There's very little of these settlements left, although those of you that go to see John Brown's farm can learn a whole lot about why John Brown, the abolitionist, was here. It's because of this. He came to help. And what's left and what this history is terribly, terribly important in establishing a civil rights imperative to give political power to people who have been enslaved. So that's going on, and Gerrit Smith is obviously a huge supporter of the Underground Railroad. He gives lectures across the Mohawk Valley, promoting this scheme of justice, but also trying to organize some of the Underground Railroad activities. And where he lives in Peterborough, named after his father, there are Underground Railroad stops and safe haven for escaped slaves. So here's a little more detail on a complicated timeline in that context. And I don't want you to read that whole thing because you'll get sick. But I will point out a few things. So first of all, in the Adirondacks, not just Gerrit Smith stuff, but all this land is available for speculation. Speculators are busy. French Indian War is over. The land is safe for settlement. Native Americans have been pushed out. So a lot of people are buying and selling land. A lot of people want to lumber it. That takes a while. A lot of infrastructure required to lumber, and much of this land is very remote, but the land's changing hands all the time. What's interesting about this slide are the names you read. So he inherits Township 34. In 1849, he sells it to a guy named Cyrus Burnham. And then Burnham sells part of it to a guy named Julius Rice, and then we get to 1856, and then Beltline has it. That timeline is highly suggestive. So let's get to the argument for this claim that there was an Underground Railroad stop at Eagle Nest. And the first piece of it is who bought that land. So I already told you about Gerrit Smith, but both of those gentlemen were abolitionists too. So this is a quote from Smith that I got from Tom Clarko, the historian, one of the guys up there. First slide. He met Cyrus Burnham and felt that he could recruit him to the anti-slavery cause. So that's in 1845 before he sells it to him, but it's suggested. So Tom Clarko, the historian, says this, and also uncovered, which I would not have found, that Julius Rice bought a house that has not been proven to have been an underground railroad station, but likely was an underground railroad station. So Gerrit Smith this is his life. He's devoting his life to this activity, and he sells it to two gentlemen that he knows are involved. So that's the first piece. Does that prove anything? But it's suggested, right? And it's more than just, oh, I don't know, this is what I heard filtering through the decades. And then the second piece takes us to the mystery. It wasn't just a clearing, it was an entire farm. And in 1856, there were 100 clear acres. Somebody had been baling hay. This was an operation, and it was a large operation. What on earth was it doing in the central Adirondacks? Nothing else like it was within 30 miles. It was all by itself, about halfway along this path that could have been used for something else, like an underground railroad route. So that's the question. And that's a question people have been asking for a long time. Why was this there? Who built that first log cabin and who cleared the land? And to this day, we don't know. But there really are only two reasonable possibilities. One was somebody wanted to log, and the other one is that. The problem with the logging, as Harold Hochschild in his history pointed out, is what I just said. It's awfully long way from anything to log. I will also add that there's no, although there are water routes by which one could traverse the forest, there aren't practical water routes by which one could float logs to a destination like a sawmill. But what's it doing there? Now, with your permission, I'm going to back up a little bit to get to something that involved my research in history and why I'm back in grad school and what I want to hopefully try to contribute a little bit to the history of the Adirondacks. The history of the Adirondacks is largely a mythology, and it's a problem. So to be fair, was it really a howling wilderness? Yes, this was far away from other things, but was it as wild as people like to say? Here is the mythology. Here is what elite white male transcendentalists, many of them, wrote about the Adirondacks at the time and later. And it is certainly a problem for Native American history, but it's also a problem for people who work here, mining, logging. It's a problem for people who try to invent new things or push new directions. This is still what you get in the Adirondack Reader, not to criticize that book, it's a great book. It's still what we hear when we think about the Adirondacks, this wild, untrammeled area. Just ain't the case. So here's the traditional history. Dismal wilderness, we hear. Nothing there. Occasionally an Indian would wander through. Nothing there until Euro-Americans start exploring it. Exploration starts roughly in the 1830s. That's when Ebenezer Emmons goes in the backcountry. In the 1870s, Verplanck Colvin starts surveying lots of it, but most of it's still unexplored for a long time. Mining first and then logging starts to develop, and that creates a tension as romantic transcendentalists who are changing the way the natural world is viewed. The Industrial Revolution is causing all kinds of problems for the aesthetic of living in communities, for even things as practical as the quality of the air. So now wilderness is looked at as something pure and godlike, whereas before it was something to be conquered. There's truth to that, but it leaves a lot out. This is a much more accurate version. First, as I already said, for thousands of years, Native Americans lived here, worked here, they're still here. Their art and culture is still here, right? The idea they just passed through is nonsense. The idea that they were always at war, by the way, is nonsense. I'm sure you all know Algonquin, Boundary, and Iroquois, the peaks in the McIntyre Range. And you hear to this day, oh, well, that's because north of the Boundary Peak, that was Algonquin territory. South of it was Iroquois territory. Crap, totally false. Then there's a period of military conquest, mapping, surveying, a lot of it in the Champlain Valley, and a lot of it, I imagine, since you're sitting here in Lake George, you probably have some knowledge of that. This part I'm interested though, that overlaps the story we're talking about. For a while, and this is where my history study is really focused, the Adirondack frontier was as important to the destiny of the United States as any frontier. For those 70 years, the destiny of the nation was changed by what happened here in this supposedly untrammeled wilderness. Briefly, just so you have the full context as we investigate this Eagle Nest question. All those were true. Structure of American democracy, unquestionably affected by the political and social structure of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. Obviously, you know, again, here we are in Lake George, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, all decided in this corridor, very much so. Sense of federalism. The speculation that I talked about went on here at a more furious pace for a while than anywhere else in the nation. Alexander McCoon bought 4 million acres and tried to flip them. He was bankrupt in 6 months. But the McCoon purchase still defines most of the northern tier of the Adirondacks and all the way outside the Adirondacks to the St. Lawrence. And when he lost control of this wild speculation, Alexander Hamilton is the one that bailed him out, bailed out the country really. And between that and what happened in the Ohio territories, Hamilton proved that central banking and federalism was an effective way to manage the affairs of a nation where things could teeter out of control easily. This one I wish I could spend all night on. It was Adirondack surveyors going through the heart of the park that we've just been talking about. Nobody knows this, by the way, it's absolutely true. Adirondack surveyors who, because they learned to innovate surveying territory like this, when all surveying is codified based on flat territory, these guys innovated, crossing the interior of the Adirondacks, got so good at doing this kind of thing. They're the guys who designed the Erie Canal and built it. Benjamin Wright, who's known as the father of American civil engineering, who was the project leader for the Erie Canal, was an Adirondack surveyor. Charles Broadhead, who surveyed the eastern half, which Thomas Jefferson said, no way anybody can build a canal through 600 feet of changes from Troy to Rome. Broadhead knew how to do it because he surveyed the Todd Crossfield purchase. Adirondackers, national advances in iron mining and logging, like significant changes in how it's done. Birth of the electric age up in Penfield. Anybody know about Penfield? Absolutely true. I didn't believe that one because I have a science background, but you know what? The electric age that does things like power my electric car, right here in the public. And then we talked a little bit about the question of civil rights, also women's suffrage for sure. Also along the Champlain Valley and the beginning of this wilderness ethic. We don't want to slight that, it definitely happened. So all of this is happening on or before that buntline settles in Eagle Nest. It's not the howling wilderness. Unless you have any question, there's this map again. Really take a step back, ladies and gentlemen. This guy Merritt drew that map of the Central Adirondacks in 1860, and if you know your Central Adirondacks, that is just accurate. It's remarkable how much we need. Okay. So the argument for is supported by some luminaries. First of all, J. Theodore Cross, a mid-20th century historian. I've seen some of his original notes, they're not really very telling, but Hochschild had all of them when he did his history. Cross thought, I'm pretty sure. Plausible, at least, Hochschild, he certainly thought so. More than once he mentions the idea that this was an Underground Railroad stop, and he's looking at that timing and who bought it, and he thinks it's reasonable. Tom Calarco, current historian, thinks it's plausible. He's the one that helped me find these connections to the landowners. However, there is a pretty strong argument against this idea. So first of all, I'm going to give credit to Amy Godine. I don't know if anyone knows who she is. She just released a book. She is a professional grade historian, and she is the preeminent expert on Timbuktu and on Gerrit Smith's Scheme of Justice. So in our correspondence, she sent me this. I won't read the whole thing. You don't need to read the whole thing either, but she is what you'd call a pragmatist, a realist. And she thinks it's just unreasonable that an underground road route that could only take a few people at a time, that was so impractical, would have been the way to go. So the waterway route's enticing, she says, but it's slow and risky. People were able to go to Lake Champlain. Vermont's a free state. And I think that's good as far as it goes. And it goes a long way. However, we do have to say that the idea that you could have routes in places where there are free states and where the color of your skin might not make you conspicuous changed. And it changed in lots of places as we struggled for the war. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed any free Black to be re-enslaved, might have made it more appealing to find a route where no one would even know you were there. Hard to say. And then the second, which is the big one, is it's a bit of a problem. When I started this research, Amy Godine, who we have a great relationship, but I think she was skeptical, like, okay, like so many amateur historians, Beast can make this up. It's kind of romantic. He's worried about it because this is simply true. We need evidence, not conjecture, and we don't have it. A little bit of a circumstance with that, though, obviously, is people wanted this to be secret. So there's not much documentation of any of this stuff. It's taking a lot of work with people who are experts on the Underground Railroad to reconstruct things. So we have an argument for, we have an argument against, and we have a mystery. This Eagle Nest, which is a very romantic place, by the way. So can we decide either way? Let me get this out of the way. From my perspective, no. I'm not merely arrogant enough to think that I have helped make this a decided matter. I haven't. But a couple things are interesting, one of which I uncovered after making my eyes go blind in Syracuse. So I'm going to say I'm leaning heavily in one direction, which will be obvious in a second. So 3 pieces of evidence I want to offer you. And again, part of this is trying to present how interesting it is to study history and what the pieces of it are. I don't know how thrilling this is to anybody in the room, but the idea that we go through this process and find these pieces in this place that often gets ignored as just rules, I find worth sharing. So here's 3 pieces. First of all, that Native American path that goes to Eagle Lake, that would have been the route that took escaped slaves to that clearing. Hochschild, one of the things that he did most thoroughly was study roads, because roads tell you so much. He himself writes that all the way back in 1849, somebody cut that trail out to a road that could pass for lumbering purposes. Now, we also know, and I don't remember if I had on a slide, nobody used it for lumbering purposes until the 1860s. But here's evidence that it was made in the first place, all the way back in 1849, 1850. One thing I think you might find interesting is Ned Buntline used that road to get, he followed that road. He didn't even know there was a settlement there, but he followed that road in to get further and further away from civilization, hauled some stuff in. It was improved between 1856 and 1860. Yes, indeed. Who improved it? Ned Buntline, this is true. Ned Buntline's publishers improved it. Why? God keep him up there. He was, among all the other things you heard briefly, he was a furious lecturer on temperance. All around the East and Midwest, lecturing on temperance, despite the fact that he was the heaviest drinker known to. Like he was unbelievably. So he had come out of Eagle Lake. And he would go down to Glens Falls and then stay there for a while and go on these remarkable benders. So, and then he'd go to New York City and get in trouble. He fought duels, all kinds of things going on. So the publisher was getting the stream of this story that I read to you. Buntline wrote 160 dime novels, and his income was reputed to be $20,000 per year back in the mid-19th century from this stuff. So the publishers had a gold mine, and they really didn't want him coming to the city. So they wanted to make sure this road could get supplies on to be self-sufficient. So they paid for the road to be improved. This is the only part of the contribution from my research. Gerrit Smith's entire papers are at the Bird Library in Syracuse. They're unbelievable, remarkable documents. And I know that Hochschild and others have looked at all of the land records, all of his purchases, his letters patent and deeds, all are in these collections. So I decided to go another way and look at business correspondence, see if there's any hint from the business correspondence that might give us a clue as to what's going on. And it turns out there is. I'm not going to make you read that, but I'll just tell you that Cyrus Burnham wasn't the guy who was the agent involved in the land. He was just an investor. It was this guy named George Sanford, and he was not an abolitionist. And Sanford clearly says in the letter, I'm buying this for lumbering. So I don't know who saw this letter or who didn't see it before. That's the kind of thing that's important if you're going to speculate on things that are romantic and interesting. I myself think that history is romantic and interesting wherever it leads. But obviously you're getting the idea that my opinion, such as it is, this is not an underground railroad stop. The evidence is not supported strongly enough. Also, and this is an issue, for some reason, and it's to the end of the slide, in all those land transactions, the 100 acres were often cut out. If you're going to use the land for lumbering, that's a question, which I'll come back to. But this letter is telling because Sanford doesn't say anything about the 100-acre clearing, but he's darn concerned about clearings on other townships he's buying. So that's just one example. He doesn't want those clearings because he wants to be the guy to cut that lumber. He wants to be the person to develop that land on his terms and make money off an investment. So he grouses at Smith, and there's actually an exchange of letters, more than just this one, about other clearings. But if there was a 100-acre clearing already there, so that Gerrit Smith had established Underground Railroad before he bought it, you would think he'd say something about it. He says nothing about it. Finally, there's just this. I mean, we can be romantic, but every single name in red, it may be that Burnham and Rice had some connection to the abolitionist movement. One would hope many people did, but every single one of those was a professional lumberman who made money lumbering, all of them. All the transactions were between lumberers. And one last piece. There's a guy named Chauncey Hathorn. He's known as the first Euro-American settler of Blue Mountain Lake. He was a guide and a hunter. He came in there, I think in the late 1840s was the first time he came in the Blue Mountain Lake area. He actually is the guy who found the clearing before Ned Buntline. So he decided to make invasive operations. And then Buntline stumbled on it when Hathorn was already there. And they did become fast friends. Hathorn was his friend for life. So that brings us to this guy who was a big fan of Ned Buntline, but he was a leading sports writer in the mid-1880s, until into the 20th century. And he's known, and what he's wrote is known. He published a biography, Life and Adventures of Ned Buntline, which you wouldn't call it an objective biography, but it does have references that are useful. What I'm not sure people caught is he didn't write it in 1919. He wrote it decades earlier, and it was serialized. And as part of that serializing, he actually talked with Chauncey Hathorn, who was still alive. And Hathorn told him this. No, that doesn't, it's not definitive, but Hathorn seems to know it was been made for lumbering purposes. And the thing that's the kicker that makes it stronger piece of evidence is the by permission. I couldn't figure out what that meant, there's no other documentation. But he talked to somebody. If this was really an Underground Railroad stop, I'm not sure that he would have described it that way or been able to say that he occupied it by permission. But the fact that he did say he occupied it by permission means he knew the people and what they were using it for. Not a lot to go on. But I tend to think that if you have doubt, then you need more proof before you can make a big claim. So it's a romantic story, but we don't really know, and I think there's significant doubt. That said, ladies and gentlemen, there are some lingering questions. Still this, which I already talked about. I mean, it really is. If you look at the history of the logging in the area, it's decades before anybody gets this close to this place. There is no good way to get the logs out. So why would somebody buy that in the middle of the 1840s? In the middle of nowhere and clear 100 acres. And this thing I mentioned before, if the 100 acres were part of a logging operation, you wouldn't exclude them from the land. Sure. The whole point of building a farm and why that was a significant part of a logging operation is that's how to make it self-sustaining. That's how you can have a camp and workers and feed them. You need the farming. You need the cleared land. So why would these transactions have excluded it if that's all it was for? Question. Also, I was traipsing around with Ben Strader, who's the head of the Blue Mountain House, the Blue Mountain Center, the writing institute that's there, looking for the road. And we had this question because on the side of the road where the trail goes, where you could easily get supplies in and out, it's flat land, it's perfect. It's actually more flat land than on the other side of the lake. So why put that water between you and supplies? Just a question. The wonderful romantic thing about history is we get to ask these questions and explore them. And when we do that, regardless of what the truth is, there's more and more we understand about the richness and complexity of this park and its history and its fundamental contribution to American development, to civil rights. It's really quite astonishing. So mysteries are wonderful. We'll keep them. Thank you. So again, I apologize for my hearing, but I nonetheless will fight my way through any questions. Yes, ma'am.
What other documents about the Underground Railroad in other areas exist that might help you in your research?
What other documents about what?
About the Underground Railroad in other areas other than here might help you in your research?
So people I think is on my first slide is a guy named Don Papson. He's one of the founders of the North Star Underground Railroad in Keystone. So I've communicated with him, and they have gathered a lot of information about those underground railroad routes, even though it is still sketchy. He has nothing on this, no information. The information that they gathered in the Champlain Valley was definitely showing a logically laid out connected route that was part of a larger plan. And if this was indeed an underground railroad route, it was a different scheme, a different architecture, a different starting point even. So he didn't have anything. So I mean, it's an interesting question, but those records were pretty hard to find because once again, it was all secret. As secret as it could be. Other questions? Yes.
Do artifacts exist that would indicate it would be part of a trail or route of the Underground Railroad from a different route that might be findable or?
Boy, that's a great question. So again, I'm not an expert on the Underground Railroad, but for sure there are artifacts of various kinds for the Champlain Valley route and the route that went along the Mohawk River. Nothing has ever been found in this direction. And the current proprietors of Eagle Nest they want to have archaeologists work with them to uncover a lot of stuff they haven't uncovered yet. There are still lingering pieces of Ned Montmoren's residence there, including part of his cabin. But for the most part, that really hasn't been explored. So it's on their list. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have one here. The presentation. It takes the Underground Railroad presentation here. It makes me wonder whether history is practical or history is romantic. The romantic history is a lot of fun. There's a lot of speculation in the moments of it. If I were escaping slavery in the Underground Railroad, how would I not stop in New York if someone's offering 40 acres?
Why would I not want?
Why would I not be happy relocating to New York with 40 acres that are being bought by Gerrit Smith? What's the benefit of going from Eagle Nest and
So that's a good question. And I really wish I had Amy Godin here. Gerrit Smith and his compatriots who designed the structure of this scheme didn't want to use it primarily for escaped slaves. They wanted to promote it for free blacks, people who already had their freedom, maybe even more than one generation. And Amy could answer better than I could, but the reason was that he felt that that group of people could have a greater likelihood of success. And he wanted success more, and he wanted to get the ball rolling and have people improve the land and get these results and vote. So he was looking, and he and Frederick Douglass and McCune, all of them were looking for people who had some level already of money and some level of resource to be able to help them succeed at this. Because even if you get this land for free, it's hundreds of dollars of equipment to try to improve the land, yeah. So I was going to add something to that. So they were really targeting at free blacks, and it was a tough go. It was a tough go, even so. It's really remote. It wasn't as terrible for farming as some of the legends might say, oh, you can't farm in the Adirondacks. It's true, but it's tough. Which is one of the reasons that John Brown ended up in the heart of the Adirondacks, because he had been a frontier farmer for years. He thought he could help people improve the land. But it was definitely targeted at free blacks and urban free blacks. So downstate.
so that I just understand is that's not a conduit to a better life in Canada?
Say again?
Eagle Nest appeared to be a conduit of the railroad into Canada. Is that incorrect?
Yeah. Better life again.
So the better life was in Canada, and the need for free blacks was not in New York, in Canada.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
I can't tell you all the details. I mean, obviously there is a difference in the most of Canada and North Canada. Better climate, better environment. The laws are favorable. Fugitive slave law. If you're in Canada, you will say, but I'm no expert.
It's basically, so thank you.
Yeah, sure. Other questions at all? Yes.
Families. Free blacks who maybe got the 40 acres, are there any families still here?
No. The longest family, almost the longest known family here was the F family. And the last of the F's, I think, passed in the 1940s. So 150 families out of the 3,000 40-acre parcels of property, 150 families accepted the deed. Out of those 150, a fraction, like a third, maybe actually came here, at least for a while. And then a few dozen families stayed. And after about 10 years, almost all of them were already gone. There was, going along with that, this is something that Amy Godin has worked on a lot. There's this perception goes along with the rest of the mythology, the Adirondacks, the whole thing, therefore failure. It wasn't a failure. It was a tough go, and it had a profound impact on attitude towards property rights and voting rights. The Epps family was an exception. They farmed successfully in North Elba not far from Lake Placid, not far from the ski jumps. And they became very integrated into society in Lake Placid, church leaders, school leaders, and really had a major effect on the subsequent history in Lake Placid into the 40s. Other question? Yes.
Is the Heaven Hill Farms about the location of where the X were?
Sorry, say again, what?
Is Heaven Hill Farms
Yes,
about the location?
yes, exactly.
the
So,
X?
right. The
That's
Feline
good.
family of the huge new ski jumps. The Epps estate is still unknown. There's an archaeologist looking for it. I think, looks like you probably know that, from Potsdam University. And she hasn't found it yet. Pretty good idea that it's in the shadow of a little peak. And there's talk about maybe building a trail that goes near it, but they have to find the evidence of the homestead, and they haven't yet. And Epps moved, the Epps family moved. The original homestead is somewhere on Uline grounds. But then,
I've never seen a more beautiful view in
Oh,
my life.
yeah.
Take it back the way up.
it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
How many people have been to the John Brown farm? So you already know how beautiful it is. And when you went to the farm, did you see the Dreaming of Timbuktu exhibit in the barn? Yeah, if you haven't, that's something. Amy has documented a great deal about the history of this scheme of justice by Gerrit Smith and the people who did come here and tried to make it go of it and affected voting rights policy. It's a wonderful, wonderful exhibit. Yeah, they haven't, that homestead is a mystery and people are looking for it. Other questions? Yes.
Other stories, you have former enslaved people moving up there. If there's any record of where they're coming from, what are the routes?
Do you think so? When you have answers, I have no idea. There's so much more to be done. I mean, the people who are the experts on the Underground Railroad and those routes, and the whole story around it, there's a lot more work to be done. So I wish I could answer, I do not know. You know, not either, I would assume so. I would assume that people who are working on it here have the same thought. I'll ask. Yeah, I'm curious. That's a good question. All right, well. Enjoy the sun.
Here.